So I'd like to welcome you all, and this is Becca Pickus. So she sent me her bio, and I tried to memorize it. It was too rich, so I'm going to read it and look up every now and then. Becca Pickus is an instructor in the Residential College Social Theory and Practice program at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. She teaches classes about restorative justice, decarceration activism, and abolition, using a racial justice, trauma-informed, healing-centered lens. She teaches courses inside prisons through the Inside Out Prison Exchange Program and Prison Creative Arts Project, as well as decarceration-focused classes on campus. She's been learning, volunteering, and teaching inside Michigan prisons since 2008. Becca is also a clinical social worker with a focus in trauma, grief, and loss, as well as specializing in working with survivors of suicide. While immigration-related justice efforts are not Becca's current area of focus, she grew up in Berkeley and Oakland, California, where her parents were very active in the sanctuary movement since the 1970s. Thus, she was immersed in this work growing up and initially came to college here planning to become an immigration lawyer. Additionally, her synagogue in Oakland does significant immigration justice and sanctuary work and has a large accompaniment program, which her mom is very involved in. Becca is grateful for the invitation to work with you all today and is delighted to support the important restorative justice and refugee immigrant justice work that we're doing here at UUAA. Thank you, Becca, for coming.
Thank you. I'm really delighted to be here. When I got the call, I guess, from both Craig and Priscilla and heard about the work you're doing and what you were hoping I could come in and help with, I just was delighted by what an amazing intersection it was with my passions and my experiences. And so I am just so pleased to be with you today. Welcome. Yeah, please come join the circle. And so we'll go ahead and get started. You all have a packet with you, which is a printed copy of the exact same slides that we're looking at up here. So there's no need to follow along, but if you can see them better in this packet and will want to take notes directly on the slides, you have them. Of course, this is a resource you can take home with you as well. There's also a couple handouts in this packet that are not included in the slides, and those are part of an activity that we'll do a little bit later in the session, thinking specifically about applying trauma-informed practice to your work. So let's go ahead and get started with group norms. So I just wanted to share what I call a content notice to sort of let you know why I use that terminology. So some folks might be familiar with the idea of a trigger warning. And I prefer using a content notice because I think that it's incredibly important from a trauma-informed perspective and really just in general to let folks know if we're going to be discussing or engaging with topics that could be really sensitive, could be controversial, could be challenging. But we also don't want to presume how one is going to experience them. And I find leading with the notion of trigger warning to be a bit too kind of utilizing, pathologizing language of trauma, that this is going to initiate a trigger in people with a specific experience, when really it's just a practice that I think we all benefit from, knowing, okay, we might be discussing some sensitive, challenging topics, and I want to feel prepared for that discussion. And also I want to check in with myself and make sure this is the right conversation for me to be having, given what I know about myself, right? We're all experts on our own experiences, and for some folks, having a discussion about violence is not going to best support their well-being or their social justice work at this time. And so it also gives folks the opportunity to self-advocate and say, you know what, I'm not actually sure this is the right conversation for me to be in at this time. So it's a little framing about how I use this idea of a content notice. And so for today, just want to note that we will be engaging with some sensitive topics, and some of those are going to be related to trauma, violence, abuse, and harm. In addition, we've crafted some initial group norms in an effort to support everyone's safe and respectful participation as we engage with these topics. So the ones that I've pre-established here are confidentiality. So what is said in the space stays in the space. We do, of course, have the conflict with the fact that it's being recorded and that the recording is going to be potentially published. So we're having conversations about who has access to it and also the capacity to edit out anything that folks share, and they want to make sure that it does stay in the space. So I want to acknowledge that potential tension. Care for yourself, so please do, take breaks. If you need to step outside, get water, use the restroom. We are informal in that sense. Engage with respect with one another, so kind of basic expectations that one person talks at a time. This notion of stepping forward, stepping back is having a sense of how much space you're taking up. So if you're somebody who tends to share your ideas vocally a lot, be thoughtful about stepping back and leaving some space for folks who might be quieter to step into the space. On the contrary, if you're somebody who usually waits and listens and is reluctant to share, maybe consider taking a step forward and sharing an idea with everybody. And then the last one I have here is don't freeze people in time. This is something that I learned through the intergroup relations program at the University of Michigan many years ago. And I've seen it in other spaces since, and I really love it. It's just the idea that we're all growing and evolving, and that we want to give people and ourselves the grace to come with what we know and recognize it's incomplete, that we might make a mistake, but that we are not frozen in that moment, that we have the capacity and the responsibility to learn and grow and to know that we are becoming more evolved versions of ourselves, and that we give others the grace to be a more evolved version of themselves, whether it's from the beginning to the end of this workshop or a much longer span of time. So maybe somebody will say something you really disagree with at the beginning of the workshop, and by the end of the workshop, they have a new idea. So this norm asks us to really continue to embrace that growth and change. Are there any other norms that folks would like to add to this list before we jump into content today? Okay. Have you all done group norms before? Is this a usual part of your practice? Okay, fantastic. All right, so now I would love to get a little bit of a better sense of who you all are. Priscilla introduced me, but if we could please do some short introductions. So we'll go around the circle. We do have a microphone. Please just share your name. I know we have name tags, but it's a little hard to see everyone's name. So please do share your name, your pronouns if you'd like, and then I'd love to know one thing that you're hoping to learn about or discuss together today. All right, well, thank you, everybody. I am optimistic that we'll be able to address many of the things that you're hoping to talk about today, and it's great for me to hear a bit more about what you're interested in. Really quick, could you just raise your hand if you're involved with the prison reentry work? Okay, and then if you're involved with the refugee resettlement, immigrant action, okay, wonderful. And I know that a lot of you participate in both, but I just want to have a little bit of a sense of who is in the space. Alrighty, so let's go ahead and jump in. So our plan for today, from this point moving forward, we sort of have 4 parts to the workshop. So first we will do definitions. So a couple of folks mentioned, what is trauma? What a great place to start, right? We should all start there. So we'll look at definitions, what is trauma, go into effects of trauma. Quite a few folks mentioned that in your opening go around. So looking at the myriad, widespread ways that trauma can manifest and the effects that it can generate in folks. Thirdly, we'll look into the application of what we've learned. So now that we have a sense of what trauma is, what the effects of trauma are, how can we use that knowledge to be trauma-informed in the work that we do with our various communities and populations? I'll also talk a little bit about this semantic difference here, so between trauma-informed practice and healing-centered engagement. I'll go over those. We will have some opportunity to talk more specifically about applications. The idea was to have breakout groups so that the reentry folks and that the immigration action folks would meet separately so you could think about specific applications in your work. If that makes sense, we'll do it. I know our groups would be a little lopsided, so we can just decide together if we want to stay in the large group or how we want to go about that. And then we will wrap up today with some takeaways and opportunities for continued learning. Sound okay? Okay, awesome. So, defining trauma. There are a lot of different definitions of trauma out there. The field of trauma, kind of understanding it, defining it, studying it, has really mushroomed since the 70s and 80s, is where we see this shift. And a lot of different factors influenced our changing understanding of trauma. One seminal moment is Drs. Felitti and Anda did a study called the ACEs study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. And if you're interested, I encourage you to read more about that. I won't go over it in detail, but it was the first time that on a mass national scale, we saw that childhood, what they called adverse experiences, but what we can think of as childhood trauma, followed people throughout their lifespan and led to measurable, severe, in some instances, physical health outcomes in adulthood. So prior to that study, there was sort of common knowledge that what happened to young children, they were too young to remember, that it didn't really impact them because many of them perhaps couldn't talk about it, which is true because if it happens at what we think of as like a pre-verbal developmental stage, they literally don't have the words. They haven't integrated it cognitively in the way that we would then expect an adult to discuss what happened to them. But this study really unequivocally demonstrated that we have, in some ways, an epidemic of childhood trauma. And it identified between 7 and 10 of these adverse childhood experiences, which range from growing up in a family where the parents had untreated mental illness to parents with substance abuse or domestic violence. You know, death of a parent, incarceration of a parent is considered an ACE, an adverse childhood experience. So this was a seminal moment because we saw in the physical health world something that folks in more the mental health world and the informal mental health world, right? Folks in religious communities and teachers and social workers, folks knew through their experience that when children had severe events happen to them, it had effects later on. But this study really catapulted that knowledge into the kind of the medical scientific world. And that led to profound ongoing research studies. We simultaneously see a tremendous increase in our neuroscience capacities, especially around imaging technology, so we can actually start to see neurobiologically what's happening in the brain as a function of trauma. So that's sort of how it maps chronologically. Today, as I'm sure you all are aware of, we hear the word trauma all the time. We hear the phrase trauma-informed practice all the time. It's almost an expectation in schools. We actually hear it in prison work, which I think is challenging because prisons, by their very nature, are often trauma-inducing, so the notion of a trauma-informed corrections system, I think some might find that oxymoronic, but we're hearing it everywhere. So anyways, you'll see different definitions. I shared this one because I think it's the most commonly used one, and it's from SAMHSA, so the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration. It's one that you'll see in most kind of governmental, organizational pamphlets, policies, etc. And I think it's a good one. So I will read it once I catch up on my slides here. So one thing to note here is we are talking about individual trauma, and we are talking about individual psychological trauma. So just to make some, this is probably understood, but just to clarify, in a hospital setting, if you hear trauma, they're talking, sometimes when you talk about physical trauma, we're talking about psychological trauma, and then we also see both individual and collective trauma. So here we are, talking about individual psychological trauma, which I presume you all came to learn about, and how it's defined. So individual trauma results from an event, series of events, or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. Since we do have a smaller group, which affords us a little more time, I'd love to pause and actually just open to see, for folks who've been working with trauma for a while, does this reflect your sense of it? For folks who maybe were interested in a definition for the first time, Does this make sense? Do we have any questions about it? So no pressure to have any reflections or additions, but since this is sort of the cornerstone of our work moving forward, I just want to pause. How do folks feel about this definition of trauma?
Seems adequate.
It seems adequate? Okay. Good. All right. Yeah, Priscilla.
I like that it gives both harmful or life-threatening. Because I think a lot of times people measure trauma by something that is life-threatening. If it's not life-threatening, there could be a disrespect for it or a diminishing of the impact.
Yes.
But emotionally harmful is very inclusive.
Yes. Yeah, I love that you pointed that out. I think that's really important. And if we think about almost quality of life and capacity to be actively engaged in our lives, simply being physically alive is not sufficient for fully being immersed in, let alone thriving in our worlds. So absolutely, we're not just thinking about something that could be like physically incapacitating. We're talking about something that might incapacitate our capacity to trust others or to form meaningful relationships or to know how we feel or to dream about our future. These types of effects also severely limit our quality of life and are effects of traumatic experience, even if our life in a physical sense might not have been threatened. Yes,
And also the capacity for generational trauma. When it goes unrecognized and untreated, then, the impact on generations,
absolutely, yeah. So if we think about sort of various subtypes or components of trauma, we can also think about intergenerational trauma and also historical trauma. So historical trauma refers usually to collective trauma. So the first time we really started studying this was generations of Holocaust survivors and their children. So seeing how that historical trauma, there were individual traumas, but it was also a mass trauma and usually when we think about historical trauma, they're traumas that affect folks based on an identity that they hold and then persecution around that identity. So these historical traumas often lead also, as individual traumas can, to intergenerational trauma. I'll mention something else that we're not going to go into at length, but there's something called epigenetics. I don't know, have any of you heard of epigenetics? A handful? Okay. So this is also, new in the last handful of decades, but understanding that what we pass on intergenerationally is not solely our genes, our genetic makeup, but it's also the expression of those genes. And that is how we understand trauma being passed on intergenerationally. Some of it is behavioral, of course, but some of it is also genetic. It's epigenetic, because trauma does impact us physiologically and neurobiologically, and so our expression of our genes can shift based on trauma, and that can be passed on. There is also, though, what we call neuroplasticity, which speaks to the fact that these things aren't set in stone, that we have the capacity, just as trauma has the capacity to alter our functioning, healing interventions have the capacity to restore our function. I know that's a lot. But I hope, I have to say that there'll be a lot of things from today's workshop, like each item could be its own workshop, so I hope it will introduce you to a lot of ideas and that maybe you can continue to explore the ones that most interest you. Any other thoughts? Yeah, please.
I was going to say that lasting effects
Yes.
is so important, and as you talk about the evolution of a personality through time, you can see it may swing one way or the other. I mean, it could make whatever was the harmful event worse or moderate it.
Absolutely. Yes. So that is also key because, as we'll talk about in a slide or two, it's possible to experience something that may be understood or experienced as traumatic, but it may not lead to post-traumatic stress, let alone post-traumatic stress disorder. So we're really when we're talking about the ongoing effects of trauma, we're talking about effects that are prolonged and long-lasting. We'll also think about what can interrupt the long-lastingness of that experience, because there's all these buffering factors and protective factors. So folks can experience something that may be traumatic, but if these supports are in place and these interventions and these healing opportunities, then the likelihood of developing post-traumatic stress or post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, are greatly diminished. So yes, the lasting impact is a key hallmark of what we're thinking about. All right, so I did want to, I know this image might be a little bit hard to see and it didn't print beautifully on your handout, but I just wanted to briefly distinguish here between stress and toxic stress and trauma, because a lot of folks will say, or we might hear these days, you know, everything's traumatic now, quote unquote. Like, don't we need stress to grow? And isn't it the way that we, you know, evolve? And absolutely. So I just wanted to sort of highlight these distinctions, that we have this spectrum of stress ranging from what we see as positive stress. These are challenges, things that push our growing edge. They're uncomfortable because we're getting better at something or we're expanding our skills. This is positive stress. Then there's tolerable stress, which is not enjoyable. Like when I couldn't print out these handouts today, I would put that under tolerable stress. It was not enjoyable, but it was limited in duration. It allowed for recovery, and it didn't disrupt my fundamental view of the world. My safety wasn't impacted. Tolerable stress. And then there's toxic stress. Toxic stress is when we're talking about something that is extreme, frequent, and it extends the body's activation of the fight or flight response. So adrenaline, cortisol, we're getting stuck in this hypervigilant, I'm perceiving a threat state. That is when we're entering toxic stress. And traumatic experiences often lead to toxic stress. So those distinctions are really important, because everything that is challenging is certainly not traumatic. And when we have stress that puts us in a constant state of fear activation, fight or flight, I'm perceiving a threat, it is toxic and leads to negative health outcomes, etc. Does that distinction feel clear? And more than anything, I find this coming up with folks who are resistant to the notion of talking about trauma. So this might not be that space, but I imagine, you know, as we talk about these things in the world, some people will say like, oh gosh, everything's trauma, everything's traumatic. And so I think this explanation for how there's stress, which is very different from trauma, can be useful. All right, so I want to summarize key attributes of trauma, and this will be the last thing before we look at the effects of trauma. So as we noted, trauma can be an event, a series of events, enduring conditions, or a set of circumstances. So a key thing here is that there's trauma that can be what we call acute, which is usually an individual event or maybe a series of events that occur around the same time, or it can be chronic, which means that we're living in conditions that are consistently traumatic over time. The trauma poses a threat, like Priscilla was saying. It poses a threat to one's emotional or physical well-being. What's really important here, I'm going to combine the second and third bullet point, is that whether or not something's traumatic is defined by the individual experiencing it, not based on an objective or universal criteria. So if you hear about an event, there's no way to know whether an individual person who experienced it as traumatic. We have to know what their experience of it was. And that is because of a whole lot of factors, some of which I mentioned here, the availability of social supports, the developmental stage of the individual. So some events are traumatic for children in a way that wouldn't be for adults because of the resources that adults have to understand and navigate them. It can also be related to cultural beliefs. Something that's key about trauma is that it's a normal response to an abnormal experience, but we do have to understand culturally what's considered normal and abnormal. Also, the amount of agency that a person experienced during the event really distinguishes the degree of post-traumatic stress they experience. There's an example in a book that I offer as a resource, which I'll share with you at the end, which is The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. And he describes a car accident that a couple was in, and same car accident, and really the extent of their injuries was comparable, but the woman was pinned by the vehicle and the man was not pinned. And the fact that he could exert agency and felt empowered to fight back, he could move and try and get out of the space, was a key differentiator, whereas the woman felt completely powerless, had no capacity to assert control or agency because she was pinned. This is not, the determining factor in every situation, but it is an example of how the degree to which one feels powerless or capable of fighting back can be one of these factors that distinguishes their unique experience of an event. And then lastly, as we mentioned, trauma can be individual, collective, and then historical trauma can be passed intergenerationally or epigenetically. One other quick note that I wanted to share here, especially for folks, I know that we don't work specifically with young kids, but I just think it's really illustrative of trauma here and understanding developmental neurobiology for the sub point on number 2, that for young children, it is often as, if not more traumatic, to witness a threat to a caregiver than to experience a threat themselves. And that has to do with their developmental stage, that their idea of safety is not individuated from their primary caregiver. So just sort of an added nuance. And so when we think about babies in situations where usually, mothers are perhaps being violently victimized, that the trauma the baby is experiencing, even if they were not physically hurt, witnessing a potential physical victimization of their mother can be in fact as traumatizing as if they were physically injured. All right. That brings us to the end of what is trauma. So part 1, does anyone have any questions or things they want to share before we head into the effects of trauma?
I'm just thinking about all the people who are in prison who witnessed, who were child witnesses of domestic violence. I mean, just hundreds of thousands of them. And then growing up in violent areas if they didn't have a violent home, but and then the violence within prison and very little place to process or heal that.
Absolutely, yeah. So getting accurate statistics about folks in prison is very challenging, as anyone who works in this field knows. But by many estimates, 90% of incarcerated folks, and especially incarcerated women, experienced abuse themselves and witnessed violence and abuse growing up. So we're really talking about virtually every single person. And then, like you said too, something about trauma is that in a lot of ways, healing from trauma requires that we're no longer in a situation that's traumatic. And so I've thought about this a lot with incarcerated women or just incarcerated populations in general, like what is possible in terms of healing one's trauma when you're still confined to a space with so many traumatizing components. Because the key to being able to heal past traumas is feeling safe enough in the moment to even come out of that hypervigilant state. And in prisons, that can be virtually impossible, although there are people who miraculously and incredibly absolutely do it.
We think too about the family, that families from countries that are war-torn, or there's incredible violence of government against the people.
Yes.
And what the children experience.
Yes.
And as well as parents, but just that whole issue of the refugees coming in that background of not ever really being sure that they're safe.
Yes, absolutely. So yeah, I think you touched on something really important, which is that the populations that you all are working with almost unquestionably do have distinct experiences of acute trauma, moments when something happened, but they definitely have these chronic experiences of trauma, of living in spaces for days, weeks, months, years, decades on end, where their safety is never assured, where you never are certain that a violent threat to you or your loved ones could happen at any moment. So that is the place where we really do see neurobiologically and otherwise that folks shift into. If you think about how you feel when there's a threat, so I don't know, I don't want you to necessarily go back to like a moment that was traumatized, but even maybe you're driving and you see, oh my gosh, they're not gonna stop at the light or something, those moments that happen more regularly. If you think about the sensations you have in that moment, so maybe you gasp, you clench the wheel, maybe you scream, you start sweating, your mind goes a little, you get a little dizzy and lightheaded. That is that fight or flight adrenaline cortisol rush. Folks who live in traumatic conditions get stuck in that experience. So think about that all the time. And then it becomes so entrenched that it becomes normalized, and that leads to a lot of, numbing. It really isn't possible to know about a full range of experiences because you're always bracing for that car to go through the stop sign. So that's really, I think, one way we can just imagine what it feels like to live in a state of perpetual fear as a function of the fact that there is a perpetual threat.
I just wanted to add, you said, along your slides you could do a presentation, on that slide itself. But the whole, the term epigenetic is new to me. I understand the concept, but I don't know the term before. But it seems like so much of what you're saying, applies to the group as well as it does to the individual. And it's another way of looking at what we've all been studying and thinking about in terms of the long-term effects of the health disparities on minorities, et cetera. This is just another turn on looking at kind of the same subject.
Absolutely. Yep, 100%. I think the thing that was so important about the ACEs study that I mentioned, and also this notion of epigenetics, is that it has forcefully embedded these ideas in what has been a more perhaps conservative medical field, scientific field. So because we can now actually see what's happening in the brain imaging, in the biology of individuals as a function of trauma intergenerationally or within one's lifetime, it's useful because now doctors in general recognize that anytime we're talking about health, we should be thinking about trauma. In terms of funding, when we're trying to understand what individuals and populations have gone through, we should be thinking about trauma. So it legitimized it in a way on a kind of institutional level. But absolutely, I remember when I first learned about epigenetics, it was one of those things that it felt like I found the words for something I had always sort of understood, and now there was a framework for it. All right, let's move on to look a little bit at effects of trauma. So we've talked about this a bit. Again, I know that I hope you can see this. We're not going to go through all of the effects. Really, the point here is to see how widespread and varied the effects of trauma can be, how many different domains of an individual's or community's life and experience can be affected. Another thing that's really useful, I know a couple folks mentioned in the open and go around, that sometimes if we don't have a trauma-informed lens, we will come to know about some of these types of challenges, but it would never occur to us that it might be a function of trauma. So that's what we really want to take away, is recognizing that these all could be, are not necessarily, but could be a function of trauma. And so if we want to help folks or help ourselves in getting all the support that they need, it's important to keep in mind that trauma could be one of the instigating factors. The next slide, I've summarized a couple more sort of more practical ways that effects of trauma come up. Does anyone have a question or want to talk about a specific one of these before we move on? I recognize this is like a very high-level overview, but we could spend 5 hours on just this slide. Did you want to share
Yeah, I
something,
just
Priscilla?
wanted to say,
Please.
one of the things that strikes me about the slide is that the center says the impact of childhood trauma.
Yes.
And except for the brain development piece, every other one of those is related or can be seen or is seen with adult trauma as well.
Absolutely, yeah, I really appreciate you saying that. This is taken from a source that focuses on childhood trauma, but thank you so much for bringing that up. Absolutely, any of these can and do pertain to adult trauma as well, with the potential exception, like Priscilla said, of brain development. We're looking at brain development along certain developmental stages when we think of childhood trauma. So of course, for an adult whose brain is what we think of as fully developed, 26-ish, we could reasonably question when or if our brains have reached quote-unquote full development. But yes, that's such an important point. So any of these could be reflective of the experiences of an adult who has trauma as well. All right, I'm going to move to the next slide. So here I just have summarized some of the ideas from the past slide and just a few that we might see in our work. So one of the things about trauma is that it makes it extraordinarily difficult to cope with the normal stresses and strains of daily living. So something that might not be particularly stressful, if we think about that spectrum of stress that we looked at, from positive stress to tolerable stress to toxic stress, someone who's in a constant state of hypervigilance, adrenaline, cortisol, who's kind of experiencing the effects of trauma, even the slightest little stressor, like I can't find my shoes right now, something that would not cause much of an upset for someone who's not experiencing toxic stress, can be extraordinarily overwhelming because the resources just aren't available to manage these inconveniences. It can also, a lot of trauma is very much related to ruptures in relationships, so breaches of boundaries and roles. And so it can make it very difficult to trust and benefit from relationships. Cognitive processes can be very much disrupted. So this is where the neuroscience comes in. We have a lot of information now that shows us exactly what parts of the brain, they sort of talk about it as them going offline. So where we're seeing them firing and where we're seeing them not firing as a result of trauma. One of the ones that I found most fascinating was there's an area of the brain called Broca's area, which is responsible for language development and processing language. And brain scans of folks who have experienced trauma, if they are experiencing sort of a trigger or a PTSD episode while they're scanning their brain, that's one of the areas that goes offline. And so when people say, you know, I just can't talk about it, or I can't talk about what happened, there's a literal aspect to that. That's not just the emotionally, it's too hard to talk about it. Literally the part of our brain that translates our experiences into language goes offline during traumatic experiences as other parts are going into high alert. So yes, so in terms of all like other cognitive processes, so memory, attention, concentration, thinking, judgment, regulating behavior and expression of emotion, and then as we talked about, so can alter neurobiological makeup, generate hypervigilance, a constant state of fight, flight, or freeze, generate numbing or avoidance, and they also highlight impact of events on folks' spiritual beliefs. So meaning making, a sense of good things happen to good people, sense of belief in a higher being who is beneficent. Why would a loving higher being allow me to experience this? So wide-ranging effects. So we're going to transition now into thinking about applying, well, we're going to think about trauma-informed practice. Do we feel ready to move on? Yeah, go ahead, Susan.
Can I just ask what the footnote really refers to?
Yes, so on the slide notes, which you can't see and didn't print, but which will be sent, is all the links
Thank you.
to the source materials where all this information is derived from.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so this is our last big topic, which is now thinking about what it means to be trauma-informed or healing-centered in our work. So first, a quick distinction about what trauma-informed practice is not. So again, you all probably know this, but I remember when this was framed for me, I felt tremendous relief to realize that trauma-informed practice is not trauma treatment. Both are super important, but they're different endeavors. And so trauma-informed practice is not intending to treat the symptoms or issues of trauma. It's intending to provide support in a way that's accessible and appropriate for folks who may have experienced trauma. And part of trauma-informed practice is to really know your role and to know when referring to a psychotherapist is absolutely what we should do, because we are not providing psychotherapy in this context. We might even be psychotherapists. You know, I run into this a lot, right? I am a clinical social worker who can do trauma-informed, you know, clinical work, therapy, but in most of my roles, that is not what I'm doing in that space. And so recognizing here I'm doing trauma-informed practice, and I will refer out for trauma treatment. So just making sure, you know, we know kind of what our roles are, and that trauma-informed practice is not in any way psychotherapy or trauma treatment.
Becca?
Yeah.
So is that a controversial area in the field? Because I thought there was a videotape that some of us saw about international trauma, and that there were some people that felt maybe trauma-informed practice. Everybody should go to a therapist if you're...
Approaches is another word instead of practice that gets used for that, so maybe that takes a little bit of the role confusion of practice and treatment, kind of you think of medical terms, but if you think about trauma-informed approaches to being with someone, that's the second part, the supportive, accessible, and appropriate being, and accessible and appropriate behaviors of whatever person that's in the relationship. Whereas treatment is a specific, you know, diagnosis and interventions that are evidence-based.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad that you asked about the semantics though, because we'll hear a lot of different words. So I'm using trauma-informed practice and trauma-informed care interchangeably, but really we could change it for trauma-informed approaches, trauma-informed engagement. We're just talking about being trauma-informed in whatever we're doing. And then the distinction between that is treatment, which is going to be specifically a mental health intervention to attend to symptoms and effects of trauma. In terms of whether, I think you raised an interesting question though about whether a trauma-informed approach would cause people to think that telling folks to go get therapy is part of their trauma. Is that sort of your question? Like,
No, I guess, let's go on, because
Oh,
maybe
okay.
I'm not understanding what a trauma-informed practice is compared to trauma treatment.
Give an example.
yeah, so we mean practice in a really general way. So it's synonymous with approach. So in our practices with refugee populations, these practices include finding housing and helping with learning English, and we're just talking about like the various practices, not a therapy or therapeutic practice. Does that help a little bit? Okay. Okay. So here's a definition that I really liked. It actually came from a resource for trauma-informed care for displaced populations. So it was specifically about working with immigrants and refugees. But I am gonna read it so that we can look together at these key components of trauma-informed care. So the first that's really key is that it is a strengths-based framework. So a key thing here is that some people talk about why are we focusing so much on the trauma? Isn't that pathologizing and focusing on the harm, or isn't that a deficits-focused perspective? And so what we're really encouraged to do is trauma-informed care is a strengths. When we're doing it effectively, it's a strengths-based framework. We are looking at the strengths and resiliency and skills and capacity for thriving in folks who have experienced traumatic things. So a strengths-based framework that is grounded in an understanding of and responsiveness to trauma. So we have to first understand what trauma is and be responsive to what trauma is in our work. It emphasizes safety. So that's always key because a foundational aspect of trauma is that one's safety was threatened or violated. So anything that's going to be trauma-informed is going to prioritize and emphasize safety. And then kind of looking forward, it's creating opportunities for survivors to rebuild a sense of control and empowerment. Because similarly, that is what is often taken away when somebody experiences trauma. They experience profound lack of control and a profound powerlessness. So we are looking to rebuild those things. Trauma-informed practice also does seek to do no harm, so we want to be really thoughtful about avoiding re-traumatization. And we also want to be thoughtful that we're not blaming survivors for the behaviors and ways in which they're managing their experiences of trauma. And so the last bullet point, we're seeing their behaviors and attitudes and emotions as the survival skills they generated in response to a traumatic event, rather than sort of the, like, what's wrong with you? Why aren't you doing this correctly? Why can't you focus? Why can't you form healthy long-term relationships? Why can't you sleep? What's wrong with you? Wow, you've really developed these coping survival strategies in response to a terribly traumatic event. How can we think about continuing to cultivate, again, safety and opportunities to rebuild control and empowerment? Questions about this idea of trauma-informed care or practice or approaches?
So it's interesting when you talk about them as survival skills that they no longer need, but somehow your body doesn't get that message yet, right? So your health, I would imagine, treatment would help people understand that they don't need those anymore, but they, as you said, have to be in a safe environment first.
Yes, so perfectly said. So the challenge with PTSD, so post-traumatic stress disorder, is that you continue to experience the trauma as present. It's not possible to heal from it or move on from it because it is not experienced as having happened in the past. It's experienced as in the moment. So absolutely these survival skills, coping strategies that folks develop to genuinely survive what is felt to be an unsurvivable experience, those were brilliant. In more of a trauma treatment context, I always point that out. Wow, these strategies that you've cultivated served you so well. Thank goodness you cultivated them. How brilliant that they got you through this almost unsurvivable thing. And now that the context has changed and that the circumstances are different, these exact same skills that were so brilliant and necessary, now they're causing some challenges. They're just not as well suited. We have old tools for a new task. But yes, absolutely how you described it. So I want to be thoughtful of time. It is already about 2:25. I have just one more slide before we think about.
We could take a 5-minute break.
Oh, absolutely. Would you like to
After
take?
you do the slide.
Okay, one more slide, 5-minute break. Then we'll think a little bit about applications and wrap up. I can imagine again that this could be the first in a series of opportunities to think about these topics. So I just want to acknowledge that I recognize there's a lot of information. So the last slide before we take a 5-minute break is just thinking more specifically about this notion of healing-centered engagement, which you might see if you read about it. Healing-centered engagement came about as a response to an interpretation of trauma-informed care that was super focused on the trauma and the pathologization of individuals. So really seeing them from this deficits lens. So what I encourage us all to do is to continually expand our notion of trauma-informed care so that really it is healing-centered engagement. In terms of the semantics, as you can tell, it gets clunky. I've been using both throughout this entire presentation. But the point is that healing-centered engagement really brings to the fore that we want to address trauma-informed care from a place that is strengths-based. It's also more explicitly political and acknowledges a collective view of healing that's centered in culture. So Dr. Ginwright was working primarily with youth and with Black males whose traumatic experiences were very much collective and very much chronic in terms of the violence they were experiencing in their neighborhoods, etc. And so that is where this notion derived from. But I think what's just really important, what I like most is the last bullet point, which is that this work is asset driven. We want to focus on the well-being we want to foster just as much as, if not instead of, the symptoms we want to suppress. So again, trauma treatment is really going to attend to these symptoms that you're trying to suppress or heal. Trauma-informed practice or healing-centered engagement is really about cultivating the well-being that we seek. Y'all ready for a break? Or do you have any questions before the break?
Yeah, I got a question. Does this mean that whenever you do healing center engagement, it's with groups that are similar? I mean, all Black men, all, or can you have Black and white men? You can have Black and white men and women? I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think what healing-centered engagement notes is that healing happens collectively. And so whatever communities folks are part of, connecting with that community is going to be a component of their healing. So you can have a group where a whole bunch of different identities and communities are represented, but having, for example, opportunities to build on the rituals and customs and history of folks' communities is going to be part of their healing process, even if they're in a mixed group. Does that help at all, or no? It seems like
that helps, but I'm trying to think of, I mean, possibly with immigrants, if you had immigrants from a certain country who went through a certain traumatic event of war, then that would make more sense than if you had all people who grew up in the United States and were in prison, and I mean, they're the idea of Black men and white women would make more sense to have their own groups because they had more similar adverse experiences.
Yeah, I think it's less so that the people have to be grouped within their culture and more so that part of the healing is related to us gaining a sense of connection and reconnection with our various communities. So you could have a community of women who are formerly incarcerated and they might have a lot of different cultural, religious, racial, ethnic identities. So part of what we could think about is what are some of the strengths that you derive from your unique cultural backgrounds, or what are some of the rituals or community practices that make you feel connected to others around you. So I think it's that each person has the capacity to connect with their own cultural background, and that might be shared with the people in the room, but it doesn't have to be. Does that help at all? Okay, we could keep chatting about it. The main thing with Dr. Ginwright was moving away from this hyper-individualized, a thing happened to a person and now we have to heal them, and more so that trauma happens collectively and communally as well, and that part of the healing isn't just going to be individually in a therapy office, but it's going to be healing that happens in community as well. All right, let's take a break because otherwise I fear we won't have time for one. So I'll maybe come back in 5 minutes. Oh my gosh, we are actually on time. What?
How comforting.
What? I am shocked. Okay, this is back on. Yes? Okay, awesome. Okay, welcome back from our break, just in time to think about applications. So in order to, I know I'm reiterating a bit, but in order to be trauma-informed or healing-centered in our work, prerequisites are we have to have a sense of what trauma is and how it operates. So what it is and what its effects are. There's no capacity to think strategically and specifically about how to be responsive to the effects of trauma without first knowing those things. So we did a pretty quick overview, but what we're going to do now is use what we know about trauma and its effects to think specifically about the work you're doing. So a framework that I thought could be useful for us today, this is, I don't have my, it's either from SAMHSA or the CDC.
It's Samson.
SAMHSA, thank you, Priscilla. So here we go, a framework from SAMHSA, the same place we got our definition of trauma, that is highlighting what they identify as the 5 principles of trauma-informed or healing-centered practice. And so they name those as safety, choice, collaboration, trustworthiness, and empowerment, and then they give some further descriptions. And so what I would like us to do, and in your packets, after the page with this slide, what you'll find is 2 different types of documents, and the first one is specific to the Prison Reentry Ministry group, and the second one is specific to the Refugee Resettlement group. Has everyone found those? Okay. I think we're going to stay in the large group because it's a small, large group, and because so many of you do crossover work. But what I've offered on these sheets, I fully know that all of you are, in many ways, experts on the populations you're working with. So in this context at the top, what I've just provided is a couple quotes from a few sources specifically speaking to the trauma-informed context for this specific population. And again, you all might be super familiar with this, so we're not going to read through this at length. It's just talking about the profound prevalence of lots of different types of trauma that incarcerated women face prior to, during, and post-incarceration. And then for the refugee resettlement group, similarly, just the context of the wide-ranging types of trauma that's very common for families that do experience displacement, forced immigration, or come as refugees. So that's there as context, but what I would like us to do is move down to the bottom of the page. And Priscilla, do you think we should we start with a prison reentry ministry example and then do a...
I think it's up to the group. We were talking about just staying together and going through these, and maybe we could do an example of each on each point.
Yeah.
So think about it together around prison issues, and then think about it together around immigration and refugee issues. Does that sound okay?
That sounds perfect. So we have a couple options here. One is that you all just generate a specific example from your work that you would like to think about from a trauma-informed lens, and we can do it that way. Or I have provided a handful of examples of components of your work that we could use together. So if you look at the prison reentry ministry group at the bottom, number 1, the first example I offered is how could we use a trauma-informed lens to think about determining the objectives for the prison reentry ministry group. Maybe you already have those objectives completely written out, so maybe it means revisiting them from the specific perspective of being trauma-informed to see the extent to which maybe they are or could be adapted. If you turn to the back of that page, another domain or example I thought about is how might you be trauma-informed in thinking about how you're going to establish group norms and also rules, and kind of thinking about the distinction, whereas group norms are those that are co-created amongst participants in a space, but sometimes we also have rules which are non-negotiables. That these are really not up for discussion. They are safety issues, perhaps legal issues. And so how might you think about that with your group of formerly incarcerated women? Another would be thinking about the topics that you plan to discuss. How will you select those? How might you frame them? How might you use content notices? How might you invite people into those discussions? So I don't know if any of those examples feel compelling, or if there's other examples that you'd like to think about.
The model that we are preparing to use, the model that we are, one of the models that we are preparing to use is a solidarity circle model. And it has been pretty well vetted around these issues. It was created through the UU Prison Ministry of Illinois, and it has been used for a long time,
Okay.
5 to 7 years. So, I really like the slide that's up, the safety, choice, collaboration, trustworthiness, and empowerment. For me, it's a nice springboard for me to start thinking about people that we're in relationship with and how that's going from my point of view, or our point of view, both individually, my interactions, as well as our group interactions for each one of those issues.
Yeah.
And perhaps some examples of how they're working well or how we might strengthen those.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. Do you have some examples in mind that would be useful for us to think about together? So, what are some ways that you are ensuring, and not only ensuring safety, but very explicitly conveying safety, right? This is another kind of one of those trauma-informed components that in a population of folks who haven't experienced undue trauma, we live our lives each day, most of us are lucky to live our lives each day, where we can presume that for the most part, our bodies and our emotions are gonna be safe. We're gonna walk outside of our house in the morning, and for the most part, we're likely to be safe. For folks who've experienced, especially chronic trauma, that presumption cannot be made. And so whereas we might not take a lot of time to talk about the ways in which we're gonna maintain safety in this space, because a lot of folks might already feel that, if we're working with a population that's experienced such lack of safety, something that's trauma-informed is to explicitly and intentionally say, like, these are the ways we've thought about ensuring our physical and emotional safety in the space. Does anyone else want to share some ways that would make you feel safe in this space? So sometimes it's just being explicit about things that when we haven't experienced a lot of trauma, we're able to sort of take for granted. Are there examples from the prison ministry work of any of these, or areas that you're less certain about or that you have a question about?
Well, I'm not sure if this is what you're looking for.
Please.
But I just looked at choice. Individual has choice and control.
Yeah.
And, the little bit of experience that I've had, or, with people coming out, or even in the immigration situation years ago when some of us were involved, that idea of choice, while theoretically someplace up here, I want to give them all the choice in the world, but I know in real life this is not possible. And so that's an area that I feel I have a conflict within myself about the practicality of it and the reality of it. So I don't know, maybe it's in language, how you offer, I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's great question. Thank you so much for bringing it up. There's a lot of nuances around all of these, and choice is a big one. So I want to share a couple ideas that I think might be useful. So on the one hand, there's actually a way that too many choices can be debilitating and overwhelming, particularly for someone who's experienced a lot of trauma and who doesn't necessarily have the same resources cognitively to consider as many options as someone else. So choice is on a spectrum. We do not want every choice, like, where do you want to live? I don't know, like, what are the options? Right. And then we have the other end of the spectrum, which is that for folks who've experienced trauma, if we remember hallmarks of trauma, they are usually a complete and utter lack of control, complete and utter powerlessness, and a complete inability to keep oneself safe. And so in that sense, also, if people who've experienced trauma, we often see coercive, manipulative, controlling relationships and dynamics. And so this is what we really want to make sure we're not replicating when we're thinking about choice. But choice is always going to be within a context. So how can we always create opportunities for options within a contained framework of what is possible? So in terms of some of the examples, one other thing I just thought of, actually, Ellie's place, which some of you may know about, Grief and Loss Center for Kids. So I've worked there for about 7 years. And there's a framework that we work with the kids, that we use with the kids, but I find it super useful in all contexts. So if the kids are doing something that isn't okay, usually because it's a safety concern, our framework is acknowledge the feeling. So, wow, I can see that you're really enjoying climbing on the blinds. And then set the boundary. Unfortunately, that's not safe for our bodies and it's not respectful for the property of this building. And then provide an alternative. But we can go play in the jungle gym. And so of course you'd adapt that, age-wise, but I think it might be useful as we think about choice. If somebody says, I want to live in San Diego, you could say like, I really hear that, who wouldn't want to live by the beach? I want to live in San Diego, like what an understandable desire. Unfortunately, we don't have the resources or the capacity or whatever to house folks in San Diego right now, but here are some of the options that we have. Look, let's look at this apartment or this family who's interested in hosting somebody. So finding where, and maybe in that context, there might actually not be choice. Like I can see how you really want to be able to choose where you live, and gosh, does that make sense, considering how many places haven't been a good home experience for you. My goodness, like I can see how finding a safe, healthy home is the utmost importance to you. This is the space we have available, and I want to tell you why it's safe. And then I want us to think together about how we're going to furnish it, because I want you to choose the paint for your room, or I want you to choose the color of your sheets or whatever. So finding, there's always an option for choice, we just have to establish the context. Does that help with this? And that reinforces that they do have agency, that they do get to exert control. They don't just have to be told what it is, but that doesn't mean they get to choose anything in the world.
To me, there's almost a direct segue over to trustworthiness around this same issue on the other end of it, around interpersonal boundaries.
Yes.
It's so important to establish trustworthiness in your relationships. And I think it's hard for us to understand the depth of how important interpersonal boundaries, the essential role that boundaries play in that. For example, giving somebody your phone number.
Yes.
Something that's simple.
Yes.
Or, that's.
Yeah, so I will add on a bit to that too. I think this is, I'm so delighted with the things that have emerged thus far because I think they are foundational, so important. So this notion of trustworthiness and this notion of interpersonal boundaries, I think is so essential and also sometimes a little bit complicated and something that really requires us to be intentional and thoughtful ahead of time. So again, when we think about folks who've experienced trauma, one of the things that's likely happened is a lack of trustworthiness, that things they trusted, whether it was they trusted another person, they trusted that they would be safe at school that day, they trusted that their community would be safe to raise their family in. Whether it's interpersonal or larger, that trust has been profoundly violated. For folks who have chronic trauma, they've perhaps never experienced a genuinely trustworthy relationship. Another thing that is a hallmark of trauma is a transgression of boundaries around safety, emotional, physical, or otherwise. And that's where we see this intersection of trustworthiness and boundaries. And so there's a lot of complexities that come up. One might be that, and this is where we kind of jump to thinking about how the behaviors, et cetera, of someone who's experienced trauma, that when we view them in a trauma-informed way, we see them as survival strategies that enable them to survive circumstances. But now, those same survival strategies might be really maladaptive. There's ways that some folks who've experienced trauma their whole life and have never had relationships with appropriate boundaries, that they don't know how to have relationships with appropriate boundaries, and that they might continually seem to transgress those or try to transgress those. And again, understanding that this was a survival strategy that enabled them to cope with circumstances. And it can put us in a tricky situation because they might feel that what could be seen as pretty typical, safety-based, appropriate boundaries are in fact acts of profound rejection. You don't love me if you don't do this. Or I thought I could trust you, but you won't do this. These are just examples. Everyone is gonna be different. But in thinking about boundaries, one thing we don't wanna do is fail to assert them up front and then have an experience where they thought something was promised or appropriate, and now we're pulling back and saying, actually, you can't do that, because that is experienced as a breach of trust. And that will kind of snowball this experience that no one is trustworthy. So, in thinking about boundaries, are we sharing our personal phone numbers? Transportation, like in what ways is that part of the services we provide, and in what ways is that going outside of what we provide? So much of what this work is attending to people's needs. So it can be really complicated sometimes, but it is so important to ascertain where those boundaries are and to communicate them super clearly right at the beginning. Are there any specific issues around boundaries that folks are navigating or wondering about? I know for Ellie's Place, for example, that's a context in which I learned about boundaries a lot. They have very clear boundaries. So for example, if a family loses access to transportation, but they've been coming to the grief group and it's helping them tremendously and the kids really want to come, you absolutely cannot drive them. They could be your next door neighbor. You cannot drive them to group because it fundamentally changes your role and fundamentally changes the service provision in this context. That might not be a boundary that applies to your work, but it's one that Ellie's Place established clear. And by establishing that and making sure everybody knows, people might not like it, but there's no question that later there's going to be a feeling of betrayal. Why didn't you do this for me? Or an experience of somebody feeling like they need to do this, but they actually don't have the capacity as a volunteer. So these boundaries really do keep people safe and keep the service or the relationships grounded in trust and consistency and reliability. And I guess that's one other thing I will say is that for folks who have experienced relationships that lacked appropriate boundaries, that had transgressions, physical, emotional, sexual, etc., experiencing relationships with boundaries is initially going to be very aversive, but it is ultimately going to be very healing. And again, you're not in a therapist role, but just to know it likely will generate pushback, or it could, but it is also, in fact, what will be most nourishing. It will be the possibility of boundaried relationships moving forward.
But when we've had discussions at PCAP workshops inside about what are your top 3, 10, whatever that you want help with in reentry, accountability is always number one. Well, accountability, budgeting, and time management are the 3 that the skills that they want. But they said because they've so adapted to the manipulation and the skirting and and that they want to be able to develop really trusting relationships with people when they get outside, because they don't have that inside. All they learn to do is to get what they think they want and need, however that is. So accountability is always one of the top 3 things that come up in that reentry discussion.
Absolutely. Yeah, it is. I mean, it is such a gift to have and express boundaries in our relationships. It's an act of love. But with anybody. But it can also be responded to in a way people can not like it, at times, sometimes they're so grateful for it, other times they might respond very poorly. So that's just something for us to keep in mind, that it takes a lot of kind of grounding to remember why we have made these policies and why we're upholding this, even when we're being told that you don't care about me, you're ruining my life, anything that might be offered in response to that boundary. Yeah, go ahead, Dawn.
There are different types of boundaries. There are personal boundaries and there are organizational boundaries.
Yes, yes.
And of course, the organizational boundaries are established by a group, and everybody needs to be able to adhere to those. But personal boundaries can be very challenging because it requires our personal judgments about situations that we may not be entirely familiar with.
Yeah, that's such an important point. Did you want to say more about that? So something that I would really advocate, and something I think, again, to use Ellie's Place as an example, I think they do really well, is that when you're operating in your capacity as part of an organization, that it really is the responsibility of the organization to make these policies clear and then to communicate them to individuals so that even when you're in a context where you're one-on-one with somebody, you can say, well, actually, as part of the UU Immigration Action Coalition, like what I'm able to do or what I'm able to offer or our policy around this is, and I think that really protects everybody. So, of course, that's iterative because you might find yourself in a new situation. I never thought about this before. Maybe organizationally it hasn't come up. So then to bring that back and think about it together.
I appreciate what you said, Donna, about individual, you have to use your individual judgment. I think that's how you put it. I appreciate what you said about individual judgment because the organizational boundaries are like policies, rules and regs. Individuals, we have to have a deeper understanding of these principles to be able to make those good choices. But these are the rules and regs. This is the conceptual framework for how we make those on-the-spot decisions about boundaries.
Yeah, and I mean, if y'all are interested, something that I've done in other spaces is to, come together and kind of use this as a framework and think about like case studies or scenarios that you've had. You're obviously not going to be able to anticipate every single scenario, but really help each other practice and share what you did in a certain instance, what worked, what didn't work. So you're increasing this kind of, toolbox of knowledge for the different types of scenarios that are likely to emerge. Do we want to maybe spend 5 minutes thinking, I guess we are thinking quite generally, but I just want to make sure there's space if there was something more specific to the refugee resettlement work around these topics that folks wanted to raise, but if not, that's completely fine as well.
I work with refugees family a fair amount, and the thing I'm thinking about quite a bit right now is choice, the issue of choice.
Yeah.
And how safety and trustworthiness, or safety and boundaries are so intertwined in that. Because I think there are times there can be times when as we're making individual decisions about this boundary, I'm a little ambivalent about it. It doesn't honor the person's choice if you don't honor the boundaries. When we break boundaries, it has consequences, negative consequences.
Yeah.
And it's so important. It's such a basic thing, but sometimes there's swimming around trying to figure out, well, what did this really hurt?
Yeah. So I don't know if I know enough about the scenario. A trauma-informed perspective would be that in which we prioritize, to some extent, first and foremost, the person's physical and emotional safety. And if a person, because of their past experiences, does not feel emotionally, and they probably also don't feel physically safe with somebody for kind of whatever reason, then the trauma-informed approach would be to ensure their safety. Now, sometimes that's not going to be possible. Is the person going to have to go to a public space, to school, to a doctor's office? So it's not always possible, but maybe even particularly in their home, which is what we're trying to create as the heart of safety. And also what's crucial to understand about trauma is that if a person is experiencing the toxic stress around past traumatic experiences, again, they're in this fight or flight hypervigilance state. So they are not in their prefrontal cortex and their reasoning, judgment, thinking through, oh, I can now see this person isn't a threat. In fact, I'm tying gender to something that was a specific person. None of the capacity to access that reasoning part of the brain is accessible when we're in a hypervigilant, hyper-aroused fight or flight state. So the only way, hopefully that person will over time be able to distinguish the difference between individuals who are harmful and individuals who aren't, but that's only possible if they are in a place where they don't feel triggered, and I think they're telling us they feel triggered. So it's not going to have it unfortunately can't have the desired result.
Sort of presentation the other day where this woman was saying that clarity is kindness. And I know for me, sometimes it's like I'm trying not to be clear because I think I'm being kind, but it's actually just the opposite. So I think
That's really nice.
That's beautiful. Thank you, Kathy. I actually also want to circle back to this clarity as kindness point. I think it is a kind of a brilliant, I'm noticing the time, perhaps takeaway from this. It's not the only takeaway, but in order to be trustworthy and to convey safety, like I mentioned before, we have to be explicit about it. And even to provide choice, people have to have insight into what those options might be. And oftentimes we don't think to explicitly put them out there. So I think what you said, this idea about let's write them down, that is so important on so many levels because that's when you can share them with the populations you're working with. And that's also the necessary prerequisite to collaboration and empowerment, two of these others. If the current operating policies aren't written down, how can anyone else collaborate and say, I actually have a question about this one, or I'm actually uncomfortable with this one? And the empowerment piece is that then the individuals, even individuals who are in a disadvantaged position or a position of great need, they can say, I don't want this. And that's really important for us to be able to say, this is what we have to provide. It has boundaries, it's policy, dependent, and the person can say, I don't want this thing, or I do want this thing, and that is part of them having control and choice and empowerment. So something like writing stuff down and sharing it is actually super trauma-informed. So we just have 5 minutes, so I think I'm going to move to kind of finish up the rest of the slides here. This is what we've been doing. And so what I just have is some recommendations for continued learning. So there are lots of ways to learn about these topics, and you have them printed on your slides as well. These are 3 books that I really recommend around trauma in general. So learning more about trauma and its effects and how to work effectively with folks who've experienced trauma. The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk is, I think, the seminal text in understanding, sort of going back to this ACEs study, sort of what we have learned about trauma neurobiologically, behaviorally, and from a treatment perspective. He is a psychotherapist and a researcher, so there is a lot that is more treatment specific, but you can look at the chapters individually, and I assign this book in all my classes, and I return to it constantly. I will say, as someone, who's experienced my own trauma, this book was difficult to read for me at some moments. So as a content notice, if you are somebody who may see yourself in this description of trauma, I just want you to know that it can feel a little hard to read about what's going on neurobiologically, might give you insight into something for yourself or your loved ones. So I just want you to know going into it. Trauma stewardship is a newer text that's really popular in social work and other kind of quote-unquote helping profession programs these days. It's all about how to be thoughtful about caring for yourself as a prerequisite to effectively caring for others. So it's not saying, you know, if you're working with someone who's experienced trauma, you're going to be horribly traumatized. But it is saying that we bring our own experiences and emotional states and moods to our work. And so being thoughtful and informed about that makes us better practitioners. Companioning the Bereaved is a very different kind of text. It is from the grief and loss kind of field. But Alan Wolfelt is one of my favorite grief and loss researchers, knowledge providers, and he presents, I can't remember if it's 10 tenets, but whenever someone experiences trauma, there's a component of loss. Whether it's a loss of our safety, a loss of our trust, a loss of, so it's not necessarily a loss like someone died, but there's a loss of predictability, of health, of fill in the blank. And so this book is all about how to not try and fix people's grief. So when we have loss, the response is grieving. It's all about how not to fix people's griefs. It's how to companion them in their grief journey. You're not taking it away, you're providing support. So I really love this text from that perspective. I provided some prison reentry specific resources. I'm sure many of y'all are already familiar with these, but I love Becoming Miss Burton. I teach it in my classes. If you don't know about her, she's absolutely remarkable. There's a SAMHSA publication that I actually find pretty useful. I often find some of the more institutional governmental documents less responsive, but I found this one useful. And then for anyone who hasn't listened to the While We Were Away podcast that PCAP, the Prison Creative Arts Project, produces, it is entirely by and for people returning from prison. So it's all of their stories of reentry and then giving advice to those who are reentering soon. And so I specifically want to highlight Tony and Asia's story because they talk about trauma in particular, but there's 3 seasons.
There's what?
3 seasons of episodes available. And these are all links. For the refugee resettlement group, this isn't my area of expertise, so I don't have as many texts, but in my research for today, I found this trauma-informed care for displaced populations guide to be incredibly useful. That's where I drew the trauma-informed care definition. So I would encourage y'all to check that out. And then 2 other sites that are specific to thinking about childhood traumatic stress, and then the National Institute of Health thinking about trauma-informed care. So, yes, go ahead.
Well, and your grief book is really applicable because they've lost their life.
Oh,
They've lost
absolutely.
their community. There's huge loss in the
Absolutely.
refugee population. So that's a really good choice right there.
Oh, good. Yeah, so those first ones are kind of not population specific. They're just, if you're working with folks who've experienced trauma, and then the next ones were a little more population specific, but absolutely anyone who's forcibly fleeing their country has experienced profound loss.
Where's the trauma-informed care for displaced populations from? I can't tell from that.
That's a great question. I have the link here.
AIR.org.
Yeah, I actually don't know offhand. That's a,
I knew it.
I'll
There is a
have-
link there.
yeah, I mean, I could even click it now.
Yeah.
But, well, I have no internet connection, so we won't click it now. But I'll check that. That would be an important thing to look at. But I stumbled upon it and found it really useful.
That's really nice.
So my last thought that I wanted to share as sort of a closing idea, the thing I want to emphasize is that these are not add-ons. It's not like we have a program or a policy or a group and then we design it and then we think, ooh, let's make sure it's trauma-informed. It has to be the lens through which we create everything. And then what I added, and this is actually from the literature on universal design, but just to keep in mind that this is not a special requirement or change for the benefit of a small proportion of people, you know, those with specific disabilities or those who've experienced certain trauma, that in fact, when we do what trauma-informed care asks of us, which is to learn about and understand people's experiences, including their experiences with trauma, to prioritize those 5 pillars of safety, choice, collaboration, trustworthiness, and empowerment, and then work towards healing and thriving, that everybody benefits. So that the same practices that we implement from a trauma-informed perspective are practices that really benefit everybody. So I hope we can see it as a beneficial and worthwhile investment, despite the fact that it does take quite a lot of learning and thinking and intention. And that's all I have for you today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.